Yeah, so when I think about potential EV drivers, I think about people that are early technology adopters. They're probably more aware of environmental issues in general and concerned about them and might be interested in reducing their own personal environmental footprint. So when they look at a buying decision, they want to understand what we call the full life cycle of any product that they buy and consume or buy and use. And that we'll dig into what the full life cycle means. But really, you're looking at everything from the manufacturing process, all the raw materials that go into that, all of the operation of the vehicle, and of course, the end of its life.
Joining us today is Rick Johnson, Director of Sustainability at Entergy. Rick has worked for Entergy since 2001, nearly 23 years. Rick's passion for EVs extends beyond his work at Entergy. In his spare time, he maintains a personal YouTube channel and a Facebook group dedicated to EV enthusiasts. If anyone can help us bust the myth that EVs are worse for the environment, it's Rick. Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Rick, I'm thrilled that you're here. If there's anyone who we can nerd out on the environmental impacts on electric vehicles, it's definitely you. You've been the Director of Sustainability at Entergy, and you've been here for over 20 years now, really helping the company on our journey to bring more green solutions in the way we generate power. Based on this amazing experience, I feel like you're the best person who can answer this question. What is climate change, and how bad is it?
That's a great question. In the simplest terms, climate change really is the accumulation of certain gases in the atmosphere that has occurred since the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. As we as a society, to meet our energy needs, have burned fossil fuels, starting with coal in the 1700s and then moving on to other fossil fuels over the last couple of centuries, certain gases are emitted as a result of that combustion. As those gases have accumulated in the atmosphere, that has resulted in additional warming through a dynamic known as the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is essential for life on Earth. We have to have that greenhouse effect to warm the planet so that it can sustain life. The downside is, as we have emitted more of those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the concentrations have increased, and that has provided a sustained warming over the last several centuries that is really feeding into atmospheric processes that are changing weather patterns, that are causing more frequent and extreme weather events, and they're having other impacts on the atmosphere, on the biosphere, and other environmental systems.
Great explanation, good grounding. I think we've all experienced some of those strange weather patterns that you're talking about. And so the topic today is that EVs are worse for the environment or bad for the environment. Let's unpack that. Why do you think this is a concern for potential EV drivers?
Yeah, so when I think about potential EV drivers, I think about people that are early technology adopters. They're probably more aware of environmental issues in general and concerned about them and might be interested in reducing their own personal environmental footprint. So when they look at a buying decision, they want to understand what we call the full life cycle of any product that they buy and consume or buy and use. And that we'll dig into what the full life cycle means, but really you're looking at everything from the manufacturing process, all the raw materials that go into that, all of the operation of the vehicle, and of course the end of its life. And we'll dig into what each of those, each aspects means for different types of vehicles and what that looks like in terms of overall environmental impact.
Yes, we will.
So let's really get into the same page on what we're comparing EVs to, fossil fuels, right? So what are the environmental impacts right now of driving a car that burns fossil fuels?
Yeah, so for every gallon of gasoline, you emit about 20 pounds of CO2, carbon dioxide, which is kind of the main greenhouse gas from burning fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide is one of those gases that accumulates in the atmosphere that is, causing that long-term sustained warming that we're seeing. When you drive an internal combustion engine vehicle, ICE is a common term for that. Fossil fuels, they release that carbon dioxide, and that of course continues to increase that concentration. You think about the number of vehicles that are here on the planet. I mean, you think about millions of people here just in the U.S., hundreds of millions of vehicles at least, and then you've got the rest of the world that has billions of vehicles. And so all of those vehicles are contributing to concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, which contributes to that warming that we're seeing.
But driving an electric car can't be completely carbon neutral, right? So what are the impacts, the environmental impacts of driving an electric vehicle?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, let me define what we mean by carbon neutral. If you look at that full process from the mining of the materials to the manufacturing, all the way to the operation and then the end of life of a vehicle, an electric vehicle, certainly during its operation and use, has zero direct emissions. Now, there's emissions that you have to account for associated with the power used for charging, and we'll talk more about that. But if you look at that mining and manufacturing part of the life cycle of a vehicle, that's the part where EVs have a higher impact on the environment. There's more emissions associated with the mining associated with the materials that go into the battery, and then of course the battery manufacturing. But then eventually during that operation cycle, you end up offsetting those early emissions by avoiding those direct emissions when you're driving the vehicle. Again, still accounting for the power that's being used to charge the vehicle.
So you talked about the batteries. What goes into the batteries? How are they produced? What kind of materials are used to produce those batteries?
Yeah, so most modern EVs today are using lithium-ion batteries, which is the same technology that we all carry around in our pocket all day in our cell phones and other electronic equipment that has rechargeable batteries. So lithium-ion technology includes, in terms of materials, includes lithium, includes some graphite and cobalt and some other minerals that go into their manufacture to basically drive the chemistry associated with storing electrical energy. Those materials are mined from the earth, and so that's where the mining process has an environmental impact. Bring it into the U.S. or into countries that do have the values that we have when it comes to environmental protection and human rights. That's a very important part of the front end production part of an electric vehicle.
And there's a big push right now in the U.S. to bring a lot of that battery manufacturing domestically.
There is.
Tax incentives that are available for car manufacturing and people buying the cars themselves really focus on that domestic side. So it's exciting.
Absolutely. There's a lot of that scaling up in terms of battery production, as well as battery recycling, which we'll talk about in a few questions.
So we know the manufacturing and the battery production create, an environmental impact when it comes to EVs. But driving an EV is neutral. We know driving an ICE car, an internal combustion engine car, has emissions throughout its life cycle of driving. So kind of looking at the two, where does it flip? When EVs do they become more environmentally friendly, and when does that happen?
Yeah, it's a great way to word the question, that flip, because what you see is of course, EVs, their highest point of emissions are during manufacturing, and then of course, depending on the source of the charging, the power that's used to charge the vehicle. But if you look at the gasoline vehicle, the highest point of their emissions is of course their operation when they're burning fossil fuels. So I've seen several studies on this, and that breakover point where essentially the electric vehicle has avoided enough direct emissions, again, still accounting for the power used to charge, the electric vehicle has avoided enough direct emissions such that it offsets the emissions that were, the additional emissions that are resulting from the manufacturing process. So it's somewhere between 20 and 50,000 miles. I've seen different studies that have different numbers.
Depends on the car.
Depends on the car, depends on its size, depends on its use, all those things. That breakover point, or the point at which those early emissions are offset, occurs somewhere in that range. And beyond that, even with the end-of-life emissions expected for the electric vehicle, you are beyond carbon neutral and reducing emissions compared to driving an ICE vehicle.
Just for our listeners, what do you mean by end-of-life emissions?
Yeah, end-of-life means it's just like anything we use, right, that we eventually either throw away or recycle. Mm-hmm. When the vehicle has exhausted its usefulness, it's not functional anymore. We've all had cars die on us permanently, and we send them to the scrapyard, right? Mm-hmm. It's a sad day, but it does happen. And so that end of life, and we'll drill into what we talk, when you look at that end of life and the battery recycling opportunities and reuse opportunities, it's an exciting opportunity because there are reuses for electric vehicle batteries that we're seeing in the marketplace.
Well, and I think we're going to get to that, but going back to the battery, making the battery, that's where we're getting a lot of the emissions for EVs from. Are there advances coming for batteries? Like, where are we headed? Is this going to get better?
Yeah. And the big question is when, right? Because there are technology or advances in battery chemistry that are being worked on. So I mentioned that current modern EVs are using lithium ion. There are some manufacturers that are starting to put a battery called lithium iron phosphate into the vehicle that has a higher energy density, so it's better performance, and it also avoids some of those minerals that are contained in the lithium ion batteries, such that you avoid having to mine those resources, and they're actually easier to recycle as well. So as battery technology continues to advance, you will see the overall life cycle impact of EVs further reduce.
Getting better and better.
Getting better and better over time.
Love that.
Yeah.
So how does the shelf life of an electric vehicle compare to an internal combustion vehicle?
Yeah, I love this question because when I traded in my old vehicle for my EV about 2 years ago, it had almost 300,000 miles on it. And that, Amy's face says it all, right? That's a lot of miles for any vehicle, right? And so will my EV make that? I mean, it's almost 2 years old, and it is, I've got about 38,000 miles on it. And that's the real question, is how long is it going to last? You know, kind of the gold standard of a vehicle, since I was a kid anyway, was if it needs to make it to at least 100,000 miles, right? So, you know, I've seen anecdotal evidence and stories about EVs lasting hundreds of thousands of miles. Of course, we've also seen the opposite. We've seen anecdotal evidence and stories about EVs failing and having to replace the battery and early in the vehicle's life. The good news is the federal law requires EV manufacturers to provide the owner with an 8-year, 100,000-mile warranty. This is federal law. It's required for all EVs sold in the United States. So that low-end risk is really hedged by the inclusion of that warranty in the vehicle purchase. And then, you know, once you get to 100,000 miles, you know, I think eventually what we'll see is kind of a normal distribution or a bell curve of, you know, some vehicles failing below 100,000 miles, which will be covered under warranty. But then I think we'll see, you know, some lasting hundreds of thousands of miles, but most of them will last at least 100,000 miles or more because of that low-end protection with the warranty.
And that's such an important fact, too. That's something we always hear from consumers on big concerns about how long the battery's going to last. So, because they compare it to, the battery in their cell phone, that's usually the first thing to go wrong with the phone. And so they're thinking the same thing's going to happen with a car. So that federal mandate law requiring that is really important and cannot be understated. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Peace of mind. Really.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. So something we touched on but didn't talk about, the other factor is the power comes from somewhere that's powering these cars. Is it always a clean resource? Where does it come from?
Right. It's an important aspect of the vehicle's overall life cycle emissions impact and carbon footprint. EV chargers are powered by the same grid that you and I use at our homes, right? The same power grid you have at home. You plug in, you know, to charge your cell phone. It's the same grid you use. It's supplying the power to most EV chargers. I say most because there are some one-off chargers that might be dedicated to a specific power source. That's the exception, not the rule. For the most part, they are just attached to the grid. And so the power that is going into the vehicle depends on the region of the country where you are. Some regions are heavier on coal, some are heavier on hydro and have almost no emissions. Some are heavier.
What do you mean by hydro, by the way?
Oh, hydroelectric energy production, dams basically.
Yeah.
The U.S. power grid overall, it's about 20% coal, about 40% natural gas, it's about 18% nuclear, and then 22% renewables. This is 2022 numbers. So you're looking at, about 40% being from emission-free resources, nuclear and renewable sources, which includes solar, wind.
More than I thought. That's great.
That's great. Certain regions are better than others. Of course, Entergy's region, we have primarily natural gas. We're lower on coal. We have primarily natural gas, but we have a large capacity of nuclear, which is carbon-free. And we also, of course, have an increasing number of renewable facilities coming online, and we expect that to continue to increase year over year over the decade and beyond to come. Well, so let's think about it from a worst-case scenario. Let's say an EV is attached to a grid that is only coal. When you run the numbers, you still have a slight environmental benefit if you're burning coal to charge a vehicle. It's not great, not as great as when you look at other power mixes, but it's still a slight emissions reduction benefit. we all know that's the worst case scenario. And if you look at the U.S. power grid example and other regions that have a lot of carbon-free energy on their grid, then that emissions reduction during the operation cycle of the vehicle gets better and better. And will continue to get better as the grid continues to transition to low to zero carbon resource. That's what really excites me, because you're seeing our grid and other utilities around the country deploy carbon-free resources throughout the country. And it's what that means is, as power and energy needs get electrified, we are really going to continue to see reductions in the overall footprint of the economy.
Yeah, that's great. So you're saying, let me make sure I'm summarizing this correctly, even in a worst case scenario, even if your EV is powered only by fossil fuels, coal being the worst, it's still over the 100,000-mile lifespan better for the environment than the traditional ICE cars that we drive today.
Yeah, because if you think about a coal plant or any power plant, really, it's scaled up, right? Anytime you scale up a process like that, it's much more efficient from an energy conversion standpoint. The vehicle has a small engine that is converting that chemical fuel, gasoline or diesel, into energy. It's much less efficient than a large power plant that is designed to convert that that chemical energy in coal and other fossil fuels into electrical energy.
And the emissions are centralized and can be better controlled versus
Better controlled, for sure.
thousands of miles on the road.
Yeah,
where
that's a great
people are
point.
living, working, et cetera. So it's the health risk as well too. So
That's a great point.
Yeah, great explanation. And it's getting better and better, which
And
is
it's
the
getting
good
better,
news.
better. Again, that's the worst case scenario. There's almost nowhere that uses just coal. That grid transition just continues, and as it does, it'll just continue the emissions case for EVs.
Yeah, I think this is the most exciting part of the conversation that I'm most excited about, because this is your area of expertise here at the company. And so when we look at what we're doing as a company and the progress we're making towards bringing on renewables, can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, for sure. So since 2000, and we set our first carbon goal back in 2001, but since 2000, our CO2 emission rate has gone down about 30%, and our absolute carbon dioxide emissions have gone down about 20%. That was achieved over the last couple of decades by making sure that our nuclear plants were running as efficiently as possible, were available as much as possible, by transitioning from older, less efficient natural gas-fired plants to newer, modern technology that's about 40% more efficient than the older fossil-fired plants. And then, of course, bringing online renewables over the last several years and continuing to do that in the future. Then bringing on several gigawatts of renewable resources, both that we own and that through power purchase agreements. Bringing those resources online will continue to adjust our emission profile in a positive way.
All right, Rick, we're going to move into a new segment here. We hear a lot of misconceptions on the impacts of electric vehicles to the environment. So I'm going to say a statement, and you're going to say whether it's true or false, and then briefly elaborate on it. We want it to be very rapid fire here. So we're going to put 2 minutes on the clock, and we're going to kick this off. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
EVs are worse for the environment because of battery manufacturing.
Yeah, that's false. As we discussed, that battery manufacturing process is higher, but eventually the direct emissions associated with operation, when accounting for all the charging, is still lower over time at some breakover point during the vehicle's life.
Electric vehicles are a fire hazard and not as safe as gasoline vehicles.
Okay, so this is definitely false, but there's some truth in what you just said. Lithium-ion technology is flammable, just like gasoline and diesel, right? It is flammable. The frequency, however, associated with electric vehicles catching fire versus ICE vehicles is actually just the opposite of what the notion is out there, the perception is. There was a study done in Sweden which has a very high penetration of electric vehicles a few years ago. And what they found is gasoline and diesel vehicles were 20 to 30 times more likely to catch fire than an electric vehicle. However, and this is a big however, an electric vehicle fire is much more difficult to put out. It burns a lot hotter and a lot longer. From a frequency standpoint, per 100,000 sales, which is how the study was presented, it's not accurate.
Okay, quickly, power plant emissions are more harmful for the environment.
Doesn't matter where an emission comes from, it's still harmful to the environment, whether it's gasoline, diesel, or a power plant. The human health impacts are just as harmful. Doesn't matter where it comes from.
All right. EV batteries are difficult to dispose of and cannot be reused.
No, I love this reuse conversation because reuse for home energy storage, reuse for even electric vehicle conversions. There's a small cottage industry out there to take older cars and convert them into electric vehicles, but really taking and repurposing a battery, that's a key sustainability concept. Reduce, reuse, and then if you can't reuse it, recycle it.
We have a few more questions for you. So we looked at both sides of the argument of how environmentally friendly electric vehicles are. But for anyone still on the fence, what would you say to them?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First off, I would say go drive one. They are, the driving experience is very different than what you're used to. When you do go drive one, leave your biases, leave your preconceived notions right on the curb before you get in the vehicle. I encourage people to do that because the driving experience will speak for itself. So if you know somebody that has one or there's a local ride and drive event, go find them, ask them if you can drive it, and just give it a spin. The second thing is if you have friends or family that have an EV, ask them about their experience. There's certainly, there will be a range of answers. Some people have had very positive experiences. Some have experienced some challenges. So it's, this is, you want to you want to develop an understanding based on someone else's experience. And that, asking them how their experience has been is very helpful. And then lastly, I would say those that are really concerned, and we all should be, about that full life cycle environmental impact of really anything we buy, but in this case, electric vehicles, go out there and read, find some peer-reviewed scientific studies on this topic of full life cycle analysis of different types of vehicles using different technologies, and just read those studies and make up your own mind.
Great recommendations. You both are EV drivers. I'm not yet an EV owner, but I was able to pick up an EV this morning and drive it over here, and I can attest to it's really very fun to drive. I can't wait to have one. Okay, final question. What development are you most excited about relating to EVs when it comes to sustainability?
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this topic and very enthusiastic, so I can't really limit myself to one. I got three quick ones though. First is those advances in battery chemistry that we talked about and reducing that front-end environmental impact. That's very exciting to me, and I like to watch how that's evolving. Number two is all the different vehicle options out there. We're seeing such a variety of different types of vehicles. We've seen that over the last couple of years, but you look forward, there are so many different types that are for different uses, and it's just a very exciting time to watch the evolution of those models that are available. And then lastly, of course, here at Entergy, I'm excited to watch our continued transition to low and zero carbon power resources such that it continues to reduce the emissions associated with the operation cycle of the vehicle.
Yeah. Thanks for doing that work for us.
Not just me, a lot of people in the company are working on that.
I think that's exactly right. When we look at what we're doing at Entergy, we're a team of teams all working towards this. And I know you have an amazing team that you work with in the environmental sustainability group, and you're going to be working to make this future for Entergy. So, first of all, thank you for coming on this podcast with us and sharing your expertise, sharing your enthusiasm around electric vehicles, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future on this.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. There's a lot of bad information out there, so I think having this podcast to help, just talk about it and help inform our listeners, I think that's great.
Thanks, Rick.
All right, thanks, Rick.
Thank y'all.
Your EV Power Source was powered by Entergy. We hope today's episode has charged your interest in the exciting world of electric vehicles.
For more EV insights and resources, visit emobility.entergy.com. On behalf of the team here at Entergy, thanks for listening.